Hello, Year 6, and welcome to Lessons 12 and 13 of History. Okay, let's see what you can remember from last week. Can you remember that? In the last few lessons, you have looked at the experiences of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people and migrants, people who've come into Australia, and how their rights have changed since Federation. Okay, so we've looked at changes, how their rights have changed, and continuities, how their rights have stayed the same. And in this lesson, you're going to look at women's experiences over that same period, how women's rights have changed since Federation and how they've stayed the same. Now, for this lesson, there is a lot of information that I will need to read to you that you will have to listen to. So keep your ears open. Okay, try not to phase out too much. Keep your ears open, listening in to what I have to say. Have your lesson booklet open up to lessons 12 and 13 because you will need to write in some answers as we go. All right, let's go. In 1902, something was written into our laws called the Commonwealth Franchise Act, okay, in 1902. Because in the late 1800s, women were not allowed to vote. Okay, they were not allowed to go and vote for who our Prime Minister was going to be when a federation occurred in 1901. They weren't allowed to be involved in any referendums that would be coming up or any form of politics. Many women formed groups, okay, called suffragettes, okay, to fight for women's rights. They didn't like the fact that they weren't allowed to vote and didn't have equal rights to men. So they formed groups which fought for women's rights, and they were called suffragettes. Many men and even women believed that a woman's place was in the home, caring for children and cooking and cleaning. And some people even believed that women were weak and not as smart as men. But this started to change around the early 1900s after Federation, and especially in 1902. The 1902 Franchise Act gave women the right to vote and to become politicians. So they were allowed to be involved in politics and they were allowed to vote. Because of that, in 1921, Edith Cowan was the first woman elected into Australian Parliament. Now, there is a lot of information available on how these women's rights changed from before Federation, where they weren't allowed to vote and become involved in politics, and after Federation and after this Act, this Commonwealth Franchise Act of 1902. And that's what we're going to look at now, is some of the sources of information about women's rights. And we're going to read them and we're going to answer some questions about them. Now, different events have happened throughout history that has changed the rights of women throughout time. And one of them was World War II. So you may turn to source B, which is part of lesson 12, and follow along with me as I read. So this is about World War II ending in 1942 and what happened to women's jobs after that time. So during World War I and World War II, women had to take up men's work when the men went off to war. They were often paid less than men. However, in some jobs they were awarded a much improved rate, so between 60% and 100% of the male rate, depending on how important the job was to the war. Women were expected to give up their jobs when the war ended and return to their traditional roles, that is, of being at home and looking after the children and cooking and cleaning. So they were working all these men's jobs while the men were off at war, and then when the men came home, they were told, that's enough, see you later, okay, you're going back home to where you used to be. However, many women enjoyed working, particularly getting paid and the opportunities that they had after that. And they were unhappy about being pressured to give up their jobs and go home again just to raise children and cook and clean. So those who continued in the workforce, they found that their pay was dropped. Okay, they were being paid sometimes about half the amount that the men were being paid to do the same job. Okay, so let's answer these questions down here about this source B. World War II ends in 1942. So A, why did women become happy after the end of World War II? Okay, so think about what I've just read to you. You may come to the conclusion, all right, that women were unhappy because after World War II they were either forced to go back to being at home unpaid or forced to take a huge drop in pay. Only about half of what men were being paid for the same job. So can you write that in your own words down here in A? You might want to pause the video while you do that. Alright. Now B, what action did they take? Now in this case a lot of them got very upset and they were starting to take action in the ways of group meetings and protests against against them only being paid half the wage of men. So you could be writing in here protests, especially at political events, down here for part B. Okay, now because these women were protesting and starting to make a lot of noise about not being paid equally and the same pay as men, something else came in. It wasn't the Commonwealth Act in 1902 or Franchise Act, it was the Equal Pay Decision in 1969. So in 1969, which is a lot later than 1902, 67 years later, okay, they started bringing in equal pay for women. Now, there was a long way to go after that time before women did achieve equal pay to men, but this is the start. So let's have a read of source C, Equal Pay Arbitration Decision in 1969. In the first half of the 1900s, women had fewer legal rights than men. For example, if they were divorced, the husband would get all the assets and guardianship of the children. There was no choice, no argument. In many jobs, women were forced to resign if they got married or were pregnant. They had to finish working. Until 1966, the Federal Public Service had a ban on the employment of married women. So if you were married, well, it was too bad. You could not work. Women started campaigning, protesting, etc., for equal pay after World War II. The basic wage for men included a breadwinner component, that is the person who brings in the money in a family. That was not applicable to women, so women did not get that same bonus in their pay. On 19th of June 1969, Australian women won the right to equal pay. However, there's always a catch. Loopholes in that rule or in that new rule meant that few women actually achieved equal pay, because some employers renamed or reclassified women's jobs to avoid the equal pay ruling. So even though women won the right to equal pay in 1969, there were ways that employers could get around it. So women still did not have equal pay after 1969. Okay, we're going to answer question C down here. Based on what we have just read, which rights did women not have prior to 1966 and 1969? And you will find that up the top. Remember the things I was telling you that women could not do because of certain situations with their lives. So for example, you might find up here, in many jobs women were forced to resign if they got married or fell pregnant. So women weren't allowed to work if they were married or pregnant. Okay, so that might be something that you put in your own words here for question C. Alright, now 15 years later, in 1984, something called the Sex Discrimination Act came in. Okay, and this started to move things forward for women and their rights. So in 1984, Australia implemented the Sex Discrimination Act. It became illegal to discriminate on the grounds of sex, so whether you were male or female, marital status, whether you were married or not, pregnancy, whether you were pregnant or not, or whether or not you planned on becoming pregnant, breastfeeding or family responsibilities. And sexual harassment was also prohibited. So people weren't allowed to annoy people of the opposite sex at work. or anywhere. Okay. So if we're going to answer questions A and B based on what we've just read, the Sex Discrimination Act of 1984, what was it designed to do? So it was designed to make things fairer or equal for women in the workplace and in the world, or in Australia in general. Sorry, not the world, in Australia in general. People were not allowed to hold things against them, not employ them, etc., just because they were female, married, or pregnant. So you can write something like that for letter A. And for letter B, how did women's status and rights change after 1984? Well, of course, women's status, they started to become more equal to men in the eyes of a lot of people. And because it became illegal to discriminate, okay, people were more open to seeing of why women should have equal rights to men at the time. How did their rights change? Okay, and the same kind of thing up here. They were allowed to apply for jobs. Right? They were allowed to be married and still work. They were allowed to be breastfeeding and have other family responsibilities and still work. And they had the right to be safe and not be harassed in their workplace or anywhere in the community. Okay, now sources of information don't just have to be written, they can be pictures. So these are primary sources of information. That is, they were taken at the time that the event was happening. And in this photo you can see two people. Okay, one of them, her name is Zelda de Aplano. Okay, and she is here protesting outside the Trades Hall in 1969. She was a female activist and she was one of the people who protested for equal pay for women. In protesting against the unfair pay and discrimination in the workplace, she chained herself to the arbitration court building. And she also refused to pay full fare on trams until women received equal pay. So she was only one of many women who were out there protesting for equal pay for women and for equal rights for women. So let's see if we can answer some questions based on this photo. See if we can withdraw some more information out of it. So who is shown in the photo? Okay, well let's click back here and here's her name. So you can actually turn to your sheet, lesson 12 and write these answers down. Zelda de Aplano, okay, is the main person, but they are women who are part of the Women's Action Committee. Zelda was one of them. For what are they asking? Well, we can look to the signs that they are holding here. And this one here, equal pay, equal rights. Why do you think they are campaigning for equal pay? Now you've got to remember this is 1969, it's after World War II. But why do you think they're campaigning for equal pay? Because you need to imagine if you were doing the same job as somebody else, but you were receiving only 50% of the pay, so half of what they were earning, but you were doing exactly the same job. It is discrimination, and you wouldn't be very happy about it. So that's probably why they were campaigning for equal pay. They're doing exactly the same work as what the men were. How would equal pay have affected women's status in society? Well, of course, that put them on an equal level with men. If they could have equal pay in the general society, they would be seen perhaps as more of an equal to them, whether it be via brain power or the jobs that they can do and their strength. Do you think these women would have been happy with the changes in the workplace due to the arbitration decision in 1969? Well, yes and no. Okay, yes, because it was brought in as a law that women had to receive equal pay. But do you remember I said that just because that became a law, people worked out ways to get around it. They would change the title of women's jobs. Okay, and say that this job would only pay half of what men did. So they would be half happy that yes, they've won equal pay for women, but not so happy that people were able to find loopholes and get around having to pay them the same as men. Okay, so hopefully we're starting to get a bit of an understanding about women's rights and how they've changed since Federation. So if we look back, if I look at this sheet here, or this slide here, if we look back, you may remember, but back in 1902, the Commonwealth Franchise Act, it gave women the right to vote in federal elections, okay, for prime ministers, etc. Alright, and then of course we had events such as World War II happening, and women had to start taking on men's roles. So, well, men were at war. But then of course when the men came back, they were told that you had to go back to work, or they were given only half the pay of men if they continued to work. And so people were a little bit upset there, and there was things such as the equal pay arbitration decision in 1969. And in this case, a lot of the time women won the right for equal pay, but some people could get around it and not give them the same pay as men. So you have 1902, where they were allowed to vote in elections. 1942 or 1941, when the war was on, late 30s, early 40s, women had to do men's jobs. They were paid well until the men came home, and then women started to protest for equal pay. So what you're going to do for part B of your assessment is look at this timeline. Okay, so sheet 9, you can actually turn to it if you like and have a look. Now what you need to do on this sheet is basically to annotate it. Now this is the word annotate up here. Okay, whoops, I've stuffed that up there. There we go, annotate. Now annotate means just to write notes about what was happening at that time. So in this case you need to write notes in here, continuities and changes. Now remember, continuities are things that stayed the same. Changes are things that changed, things that became different because of something. So in this case, in this picture, we have a whole heap of men standing up and saying, yes, okay, women should have the right to vote. Alright, so we had the 1902 Commonwealth Franchise Act. So for example, in this box here, since that act, what changed? Okay, so before that, women were not allowed to vote. Right? So what changed? And we can write in here, if I can make my font smaller. Women were allowed to vote in federal elections. Oops. Okay. So since that 1902 Commonwealth Franchise Act, women were allowed to vote in federal elections. Okay. Oh, the capital letter won't disappear there. Okay. Don't put capital A there. And don't put a capital E there. For some reason it was... Okay. There we go. Now those things changed, but what stayed the same? Okay, just because they had the right to vote, some things stayed the same. Now remember, by then there hadn't been a war, women weren't working. Okay, so some things stayed the same for women there. So that was a continuity. So I'm going to do this first one as an example for you. Women still weren't in politics, okay? That was one thing we could add down here even. They were allowed to run for Parliament, okay, so they're allowed to try and be in politics. That was another change after 1902. But up here, women still weren't in politics very much, okay? There wasn't a lot of women who felt welcome in politics still after 1902. People still believed, okay, that women belonged at home, okay, raising children, cooking and cleaning. Alright, if I can put a little dot there. And finally, they still had few legal rights. Okay, remember, if they divorced from their husband, they were not allowed to have the children. They basically got nothing, no house, no money, no nothing from their husbands if they left. Okay, so they still had a few legal rights, especially during divorce. Sorry about the going over the words there. Okay, still had few legal rights. But then, of course, things changed. So this is an example of how you need to fill in these boxes here. We have continuities, okay? What happened was World War II ended. We had World War II. Women were doing men's jobs. World War II ended. Okay, what happened then? What changed for women? And what stayed the same? So you might need to look back at those sources of information and fill that in. And then after that, in 1969, the Equal Pay Arbitration decision saying that women needed to have equal pay to men. What changed, and what stayed the same? So you should be able to come up with about 2 or 3 points for each section of these boxes. And I can't help you anymore because this is an assessment item. Okay, so look back and think back to the information we talked about. Think about what stayed the same after World War II. Okay, and what changed, and what stayed the same after the equal rights or the equal pay decision came in, and what changed. Now you may want to actually go and pause the video at the moment to finish that off while it's all still fresh in your mind, and then come back and we'll do lesson 13. Okay, so this is the beginning of lesson 13, so you can flip over in your book. Now these are the words we were talking about earlier, suffragettes, okay? And here's some historical definitions of what these mean. So for example, suffrage, okay, is a person's right to vote in an election. So suffrage, that means a person's right to vote in an election. A suffragist was somebody who supported another person's right to vote. So in the early 1900s, there were differing points of view. So there were some people who believed that yes, okay, women should be allowed to vote, and they were pro for suffrage there. Everyone should be voting. And there were some people who were anti that. So they had different points of view. There were people who were thinking, nope, women should not have the right to vote. Or, for example, the Aboriginals and the migrants. So some people were anti-suffragist. They didn't want everybody to be able to vote. Alright, so let's have a look at some of these people's points of view. Some people who were for, a person who was for suffrage, so that women should be allowed to vote, and somebody who was against it, and you might be surprised. So here is source A from lesson 13, and it is a speech by Mr. Outram, okay, so he's male, alright, male, and he was a member for Maryborough in Queensland in 1899. And he says, I say that a woman is not worth calling a woman unless she is prepared to take her part in the affairs of her country. Okay, I notice that those who oppose the women's franchise are the wealthiest, okay, the richest, and they do not know who they are, who have to go out between 5 and 6 in the morning. And there are hundreds of women, honest, respectable women travelling at that time, to their occupations, leaving perhaps sick fathers or mothers depending on their earnings. They go to work when most honourable members of this house are still in bed. So this man, Mr. Outram, was calling for the people who were listening to him at the time to say that women are doing the same things as men, but not being recognised for it. So whose point of view is being expressed in this quote? There it is there, Mr. Outram. Okay, member for Maryborough. So member for Maryborough, Mr. Outram, and it's great to see that a man was out there fighting for the women. Okay, what does take part in the affairs of her country mean? Okay, the affairs of her country, basically the running of the country. being able to help with the protection of our country and the moving forward of our country. So you can write what you like in here, but basically becoming involved in the running of the country and to keep the country moving forward. C. Is Mr. Outram pro or anti-suffragist? So pro means yes, okay, he would like women to have equal votes, or anti, no, he does not want women to have equal votes. And I think from what he's saying here and how he's being very positive about women, that he would like women to have an equal vote. What arguments does he present in his point of view? Okay, here he talks about that women, and honest, respectable women, okay, or have occupations already. Okay, that because they are doing the same things that men are doing, perhaps they deserve equal rights to vote. He's also saying that a woman is not a woman, okay, unless she is prepared to help take part in the affairs of her country. So people who are willing to help move Australia forward, move the country forward, be involved in its workings. Okay. Now that was Mr. Outram, who believed that women should have equal rights. And just when you thought it was safe, there is a woman, okay, a female here, anti-suffragist. Okay, so she was against women being able to have equal voting rights. And as she was saying, women's arguments are based on sentiment, not justice. If the woman were to take the views contrary to her husband, that is, opposite to her husband, what would become of the union or the marriage, it says. So there might cause a lot of arguments, she's thinking, if women were to take a different point of view to men. Take the case of a married woman. She must consult, okay, ask her husband. If she was a wife that anyone would respect, and would vote according to his wish if she had the vote. On the other hand, if the wife voted against the wish of her husband, she would introduce discord or disharmony into the family, and thus do more harm than good. So here is a woman who is saying that women should not have equal rights to vote. So whose point of view is being expressed in the quote? That of an female anti-suffragist. Oops, here we go. That of a female anti-suffragist. Whoops. Okay. What arguments against female suffrage is she presenting to the quote? She's saying if women go against their husband, that they will cause problems within the marriage. Okay, if women were to vote opposite to their husbands, okay, it would cause problems in the marriage. Okay, and therefore society. How is the point of view in Source B different to that or similar to Mr. Outram's point of view about women's responsibilities? Okay, now Mr. Outram was saying that women go and do jobs every day and they're out there fighting or trying to move our country forward. But this woman believes that a woman's place is in her home, agreeing with her husband. So how is it similar? Okay, or different to? Okay, the woman believes, that women should stay home, and the man believes, in this case, that women should be involved in moving the country forward. Okay? Alright. Okay, again as part of lesson 13, you will see here We've been looking at an event that happened, the cause of that event, and then the effect of that event. So, to start with, right back before Federation, the cause. There was petitions, there was protests, okay, and lobbying for the status and rights of women. People saying that women should have the same rights as men. And because of that, an event occurred. The Commonwealth Franchise Act was introduced in 1902. What was the effect of that act? Well, the effect was that women then had the right to vote. Okay, women were given the right to vote. Oh, and become involved in politics. Okay. Now the same thing down here, we have another picture here. You can see these are women here working on an aeroplane. Okay, so they were an aviation mechanic. This is when the men were at war. They didn't have enough men to do these jobs, so women had to take them on. Now this kind of showed people that women could be just as smart as men and just as capable of men in jobs. So before, we had here the traditional role of women was working in the home. But then World War II occurred and there was a shortage of workers in the male fields, so women had to take on those roles. Okay, and that was the effect. Women took up the men's work when the men went off to war, and they had more opportunities in the workforce. And you probably remember when the men came home, the women were told to get back to home and look after the children, cooking and cleaning in the house, or they had the opportunity to keep going but only earn half the pay. Big problems there. Now what your job is going to be, the second part of part B of your assessment item, is to write a paragraph about how women's rights changed and how they stayed the same after Federation. Now this here is a model paragraph that's showing the causes and effects of change and points of view about women, okay, in the early 1900s. But your job is going to be to describe the changes and the continuities, the things that change and things that stay the same, of the status and rights of women, okay, during the whole of the 20th century. So you're going to be thinking right from when the women were allowed to vote to then when they were fighting for it or doing men's jobs in the World War II, to what happened after that, to right through to when they were fighting for equal pay and legal rights in 1984. Okay, so you have quite a long paragraph to write here. So let's try. I want you to try and think about three main points that you could write about when it comes to what women were experiencing in 1902, okay, right through to 1984. That's all the 20th century. So let's have a look at how we might do that. And the first thing you're going to be doing is writing a topic sentence, and it states the topic of your paragraph. Now you can usually find that topic sentence in your question. Alright, now let's look at your question. And it says, write a short paragraph, alright, oh short, okay, I thought it was going to be quite long, explaining the continuities, the things that changed, that stayed the same, and the things that changed in the status and rights of women during the 20th century. I would look back at your timeline. That's a really good place to start, because it's saying referring to sources and events on the timeline. Okay, so let's get our topic sentence. Our whole topic sentence is going to be about how the status and rights of women changed during the 20th century and how it stayed the same. So let's rewrite that question as a topic sentence. The status and rights of women have, let's say, undergone many continuities and changes throughout the 20th century. Okay, so I have actually got that information right there from our question. That's our topic sentence. It's going to be, our paragraph is going to be about how the status and rights of women have changed and stayed the same during the 20th century. Now I'm going to choose 3 events or 3 main things. We can't cover it all. 3 things that have either changed or stayed the same since or during the 20th century. Now if we look back, and I'm going to go and find it. Whoop. Here we go, at our timeline, there it is. Okay, the first time that we are looking at in the 20th century here is 1902. Now let's look at the continuities, because that's what our paragraph's about, and the changes. What happened after 1902? Women still weren't in politics very much. There was a belief that women still belonged at home, and they still had few legal rights. However, some things did change. Women were allowed to vote in federal elections and allowed to run for Parliament. So we take those notes and we're going to put them into sentences for our paragraph. So let's go back down to our paragraph. Okay, so we can write that women's rights changed after the 1902 Commonwealth Franchise Act was introduced. Oh, get your typing right, Mrs. Canvia. Okay, so women's rights changed after the 1902 Commonwealth Act was introduced. Now let's talk about how they changed. Okay, before this act was introduced, women did not have the right to vote or run for Parliament. Okay, let's see, we need to show how things changed. However, after 1902, women did have the right to vote and could become politicians. Even though this was allowed, many women still did not, or many women I should say, many women and men still did not believe, or they I should say still believed that a woman's place was at home. Okay, now we can actually move on a little bit now. So that's as much as we need about that Franchise Act. We don't want to go into too much detail because it's only one paragraph. So let's have a look how we've broken that up. This is our topic sentence. Okay, we've had to then introduce, okay, women's rights changed after the 1902 Franchise Act. That was our first part of our timeline. Then we've talked about how it was for women before that act and how it was for them after the act. And then we actually put just a little final comment about how even though this has happened, women were allowed these things, this was still the reality for them. So you can follow this pattern for your next part of your paragraph. So if we look back at the timeline, our next part you can see is the war, okay, World War II. So remember the women who were having to do the men's jobs. So you can follow the same, now let me go down again, the same structure for the next part of your paragraph about women's rights and how they've changed and how they stayed the same. So you can actually say During World War II, however, people's ideas began to change. Now you can write about how or what were the rights of women during the war, and then what happened after that war, okay, to change the rights of women, and how they may have stayed the same. And again, I can't go on any further than this because this is an assessment task, but try and use these sentences as a model for you to keep going. Look back at your timeline and use the war event, and then also the protesting for equal pay. Finally, at the end of your paragraph, you'll use a concluding sentence where you'll basically reword your topic sentence and say, throughout 20th century, women's rights have changed a lot, okay, or over that time, or they have changed quite a bit due to the protests of suffragists and other groups. Okay, something along those lines. Okay, sorry this is a long lesson. I hope you broke it up into 2 sections, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye, and don't forget you can send me drafts of Part B. See you.